And to start, to set the stage for the main presentation on policy reforms, we have Dr. Felipe Medalla to present his views on the country's economic outlook. Dr. Felipe Medalla is a member of the Monetary Board of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas since July 2011. A former professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics and Socio-Economic Plan Secretary under the Estrada administration. He was also a member of the Presidential Task Force on Tax and Tariff Reform under the Ramos administration. President of the Philippine Economic Society in 1996 and a former chairman of FEF. Without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Medalla.
Well, thank you very much. Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello,
Philip.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you very much and good morning. I was really very touched by the short speeches given by both the spouses of Don and Francis. By the way, I circulated a printed copy of the speech because I know that most of the Zoom meetings I have attended get garbled and a lot of words cannot be understood. So for those who have bad internet, you can follow the written version of the speech, which incidentally has plenty of typos and omitted words. I also added to it the worksheet, the Excel worksheet that I used for saying what I'm saying. So, well, FEF fellows and guests, I noticed from all over the world. First of all, I would like to say that it's my privilege to be invited, or should I say designated, as the keynote speaker in this fourth Padiranga lecture. Don and Francis best exemplified what an FEF fellow should stand for. And FEF's main reason for existing is the fight for market-friendly policies and governance reforms that will hopefully improve the lives of millions of people in the Philippines. Both of them knew, to use what is now a cliche, that to do so would require a whole of society or a whole of the economy approach, but both are also keenly aware that the Philippines and in many other countries, reforms come in little pieces. And hopefully when those little pieces add up over the decades, they could make a significant difference. As pointed out by Mahar Makahas, for more than 10 years until the pandemic ended, Philippine economic growth was both higher and more inclusive. For the first time in our history since reliable statistics became available. This probably required some luck. For instance, BPO, a lot of things that pushed it were factors that happened outside the Philippines. But there are many areas where the advocacies clearly were domestic. For instance, the abolition of the Oil Price Stabilization Fund, which was a big fiscal mess because when the price was going up, the fund was being utilized. But when the price of oil abroad was going down, the fund was not being replenished because the domestic prices followed international prices. The reform of VAT is another case. And lately, the rice trade liberalization. And there's no doubt that the economy is much better now because of those reforms. For instance, when I was in NEDA, the spread between a 10-year US dollar bond and a 10-year Philippine dollar bond was 700 basis points. Now, in spite of the pandemic, it's a little bit less than 100. So, as my colleague, as our colleague Rami Bernardo says, reforms that FEF are espousing are of this nature. Each one not very large, but if added up over the decades, if we are successful in getting reforms over the decades, the country becomes a better country, the economy becomes a better economy. And he, I think, used the term raging incrementalist. Of course, it's hard to be both raging and incremental. But somehow we in FEF were able to do it, and Francis and Don Don were the best exemplars. And it's good for us that we continue to honor them. Now to my main task. It's to give my views on the outlook of the Philippine economy. Before I start, let me say that the necessary disclaimer that the views that I express are entirely my own and not necessarily of those of the BSP and its other officials, especially the governor. Although the governor and I share a lot of things and agree on a lot of things, my views are not necessarily 100% the same as his, and vice versa. Okay, since the title of the series is Jobs, Policy Reforms and Actions for the Pandemic, I assume that what happens to the economy during the pandemic is quite relevant. For one thing, it's hard to say when the pandemic will end. One can, of course, hope that after the pandemic, the surviving part of the economy, which is roughly about 10% of 90% of the 2009 economy, will continue to grow at 5 to 7%. But of course, 5 to 7%, I will explain later why 5 to 7%. Then if that's the case, then the GDP in the future will remain permanently lower than pre-COVID forecast. Indeed, there's a narrative that fits this scenario. As we as a nation learn more about infection, hospitalization, and fatality rates, and as testing and tracing becomes cheaper and quicker, we will know which quarantines, mobility restrictions, lockdowns, and other measures to control the virus, which of them work or do not work. We will also learn that which measures cost a lot but have at best temporary results in what is called flattening of the curve. For one thing, it clearly did not make sense to apply lockdowns to densely populated areas where the urban poor live in areas where physical distancing is impossible and necessary hygiene such as frequent hand washing and safe disposal of waste is also not physically possible. Moreover, locking up people in their homes without necessary testing and tracing will result in infection rates rising in households who are forced to stay together in those cramped houses for a prolonged period. In other words, lockdowns if lockdowns are the only answer to the pandemic, there should be no lockdown. Of course, the justification for lockdowns is it's a temporary measure while waiting to flatten the curve or the trajectory of the spread of the virus, while waiting for better solutions to become available. Thankfully, albeit very slowly, we have progressed significantly in testing and contact tracing, to the point where it's not likely that we will again experience the kind of lockdowns that we experienced during the last 2 weeks of March, the second quarter of last year, and the first half of the third quarter of 2009, 2010. In that sense, the worst is over. The disease has not been totally under control, but our response to the disease, at least the government, both national and local governments' response to the disease, is not as detrimental to production as it used to be. It's very important, for example, to point out that the last 2 weeks of March are the worst 2 weeks in terms of GDP. Although GDP is not available at weekly level, it's easy to to show this. The reason is if we use seasonally adjusted GDP, what you will note is the first quarter is 8% lower. The first quarter of 2020 was 8% lower than the first quarter of the previous year. That means that in just 2 weeks, we lost. We lost. My mistake. It was about 6%. In just 2 weeks, we lost nearly 6% of one quarter's GDP, or what, a little bit more than 1% of GDP. So now, fortunately, by the way, by the same reasoning, because of the very, very shotgun approach in the lockdowns, the second quarter was the worst part of probably one of the worst in terms of declines, one of the worst declines in our history. So much so that after the second quarter, we began to see notable improvements. Of course, not able to return GDP to its former level, but very, very significant turnaround after the lockdowns were relaxed. The restrictions on people movements were relaxed. So, in other words, what happened was the government was overly risk averse. It was just so afraid that, well, to begin with, the scenarios of how the virus will spread and kill people were just too scary. Moreover, the lack of testing capacity made decision makers even more risk averse. As they say in finance and economics, there's a big difference between uncertainty, risk and uncertainty. Risk can be calculated. Uncertainty at its most extreme cannot be even imagined. I guess the best way to illustrate this is to go back to Pascal's gamble. He said that the rational person should always behave as though God exists. Because if he did not exist and he behaved as though he existed, all he lost was all the foregone pleasure in believing in God. Because he believed so much in God that he adjusted his lifestyle so much that he lost quite a bit of enjoyment of pleasure and luxury. But if God exists and he behaves as though God does not exist, instead of infinite gain of going to heaven, he will suffer eternal damnation. Then, therefore, he has to really believe as though God exists and behave very well. Now, fortunately, we are now finally out of Pascal's game. So we are now more able to calculate, and government has learned as more testing and tracing happened, and as improvement in hospital and outpatient treatment reduced fatality rates, the lockdowns became less and less restrictive. Of course, not as restrictive as the economic managers wanted. But there is no doubt that the lockdowns are a lot less harmful now to the economy than before. So the result, as you can see from the quarter-on-quarter GDP changes, is that the lowest point really was the second quarter. And my own forecast, this, by the way, I had to write this speech before before the PSA numbers become available. Fortunately, the numbers were not very far from what I thought they would be. And what happened was the GDP last year, the first quarter was minus 5.7. The second quarter was minus 15.2. And as I said before, the minus 5.7 was actually more deadly than minus 15.2, because the minus 5.7 happened in just 2 weeks, whereas the minus 15.2 happened in 12 weeks. So, and then by the third quarter, it was already plus 8.4. And by the fourth quarter, it was already 5.8, meaning the worst was over in the third quarter. And in fact, the second quarter, and in fact, the second quarter was not really the worst. The worst was the last 2 weeks of the first quarter. So, so what happens now is, my own forecast using this gradual improvement from one quarter to the next, with the improvement becoming smaller and smaller because the lockdowns and restrictions to be gotten rid of are initially were the most harmful, and the present ones that are being debated are smaller, like should parents be allowed to bring their children to the mall, etc., etc. So what will happen in my own forecast is then we will get a growth rate of maybe about 7%. By the way, if you look at year on year, it will look very erratic. Like the first quarter will be slightly negative, and the reason, of course, is not the first quarter is so bad, but because the first quarter of last year was still quite high. And then we'll have a very, very large jump in the year-on-year numbers in the second quarter, maybe as high as 17 to 20% improvement relative to previous year. Again, that's not because the second quarter is so good. It's just that the second quarter is not that the second quarter of this year is so good. It's just that the second quarter of last year was so bad. And then the growth rates, the year-on-year growth rates will start tapering because of the base effect. And as a result, my expected growth rate for this year is around 7. Of course, I could be wrong. It could be that something happens that some of the severe lockdowns and restrictions are imposed again, but I think it's not very likely given that now you have very, very cheap tests, saliva tests, very fast tests. I envision a time when anybody can enter a mall because each one who enters a mall can be tested very cheaply and quickly. Going to Boracay will be easy because as you land in Boracay, you will be a very cheap test that probably costs less than 50 pesos. They know with quite a bit of certainty who is not inspected, and same thing in let's say Palawan, and the result will be quite a bit of recovery in domestic tourism, for the simple reason, at least using my wife as an example, they're all itching to travel, but foreign travel will remain very, very difficult and very, very inconvenient, but domestic travel will be much more convenient. So you'll have the economy is adjusting. You have more online deliveries, more al fresco restaurants, and so on and so forth. So for that reason, although I am not ruling out very bad, let's say 4% or lower this year, I think that's not very likely. So now let's go to what I think about the next year. This is one of the hardest things to predict for two reasons. One is to take the view that whatever growth rates we are familiar with will remain with the remaining 90% of the economy. And therefore, as I said, we will have we will have 5 to 7% growth. Of course, with but with a much lower starting level. Now, in the past, the reason we in BSP estimate the natural growth of the economy to be 5% is we use a lot of statistical tests looking at a long series of GDP, what statistically is referred to as filters. In my case, I do quite a bit of common sense, which is I look at all the periods where demand is high. Let's say 7% growth in every quarter. In other words, when demand is not a constraint, what is the growth rate of the economy? And so I look at all the quarters where GDP grew, well, no, not GDP, but consumption plus investment, both public and private, grew at more than 7%. And it turns out there are quite a number of such quarters. So and the growth rate of the economy during those periods is less than 7%, more like 6.6, 6.7. So that tells me that the main constraint to growth at a certain when demand, when there is normal demand, and we will probably have normal demand because the BSP's inflation targeting mechanism tends to push the economy towards non-inflationary growth at possibly its highest. Then, in that particular case, we will have growth between 6 and 7% next year and the years after. The question, of course, is whether this is still relevant given all the things that have changed outside the Philippines, and also given that 2022 is a presidential election year. We have no idea whatsoever what policies will be like under whoever will be. Well, to begin with, we don't know who the president will be. And even if we had some inkling which 2, 3, or 4 persons it would be, we have no inkling what kind of economic policies, implementation capacity that they will have. So but at any rate, my point is, well, until I get better information, that is my view. To summarize, just the bounce off from relaxation of lockdowns, quarantines, and mobility restrictions, and because of the very low base, 2021 will be 7%, and you'll have 6 to 7% on average from there on, until we find out that in reality the natural capacity of the economy to grow is either higher or lower. Although by the way, let me state that when you look at that growth of 5 to 7%, 2% of that is due to productivity increase, meaning the growth rate of capital and labor predicts a growth rate that's between 3 to 5%, and what we end up with is 5 to 7. That difference between the growth rate of inputs and the growth rate of outputs is referred to as total factor productivity growth. And Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Solow refers to it as the index of our ignorance. But my favorite explanation of why it's happening is that if we look at our flow funds statistics, the share of corporations in capex, in capital expenditures and capital formation, and the share of government in capital formation and is rising. The other one is, of course, the growth of new sectors. And finally, the other way to look at it is to look at the very unproductive parts of our economy. For instance, I think agriculture, construction and transportation storage account for 57% of male employment and only 21% of GDP. Similarly, wholesale retail, accommodation and food services, and other services, which includes maids, household helpers, account for 51% of female employment and only 23% of GDP. So in other words, we have a lot of very low productivity employment and jobs. And if this can move to other sectors that have higher productivity, then this 2% TFP will continue. I was looking at some informal discussion of BSP with the World Bank, and some of them are willing to accept proposing a scenario. Not all of the IMF people, but some of them I met, that the TFP will decline from 2 to 1. But as you can see, there are many things that we can do to prevent it from happening. Of course, this, again, to use a cliche, will require a whole of society approach. Many of us in FEF thinks it's removing prohibitions on foreign ownership in the constitution of very critical industries. It's part of the big answers. Some of my friends, including our President Totti, think that an undervalued peso is another part of the answer. But these topics are for future lecture series. And clearly looking at labor and land markets will also give us part of the answer. So friends, maraming salamat at magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. And I look forward to a very productive lecture series.